Argentina's new president just made the biggest economic gamble in a generation. Javier Milei is deliberately pushing 55% of the population into poverty, firing tens of thousands of public workers and slashing government spending by 30%, all betting he can break a century-old cycle of collapse that has defeated every leader before him. Think about the stakes here. Argentina has defaulted on its sovereign debt 9 times. 9 times. The country that was once richer than most of Europe now has triple-digit inflation and a currency nobody trusts. Milei's shock therapy is either the radical cure Argentina desperately needs, or it's about to trigger the 10th default and social chaos worse than the 2001 collapse when 5 presidents fell in 2 weeks. But here's what makes this gamble truly extraordinary. Milei isn't just fighting economics, he's fighting Argentina's deepest political pathology. A system so broken that crisis has become the norm, not the exception. And the clock is already ticking against him. I'm James Whitfield from Faultline Economics. While others chase headlines, we examine the systems that actually shape history, geography, demographics, and economic fundamentals. Today, we're analyzing Argentina's perpetual crisis machine. This is strategic clarity in a complex world. Let's set the stage. In 1900, Argentina was richer than most of Europe. Its GDP per capita rivaled Britain and exceeded Spain's by more than double. Buenos Aires was called the Paris of South America. Fast forward to today, the country has experienced triple-digit inflation. The peso has lost 99% of its value against the dollar in just 5 years, and over 55% of the population fell into poverty during the recent adjustment. This isn't a temporary setback, it's a chronic condition. Since the military coup of 1930 ended 7 decades of constitutional rule, Argentina has swung back and forth between populist overspending and harsh austerity, between state control and market chaos. The result? A country that's been in recession for 20 of the last 50 years. Let me show you exactly what I mean. Factor 1. The fiscal death spiral. Argentina has run a fiscal deficit in 57 of the last 65 years. This isn't just overspending, it's a structural addiction to living beyond its mean. When international markets are open, governments borrow in dollars. When they're closed, which happens every decade or so, the central bank simply prints pesos to cover the gap. This creates what economists call fiscal dominance, when government spending needs dictate all monetary policy. The debt crisis of the 1980s shows this trap clearly. The military government borrowed $45 billion, then defaulted in 1982. With no access to credit, they printed money, which triggered the 1989 hyperinflation when prices rose by more than 5,000% in a single year. That trauma permanently destroyed faith in the peso. Factor 2. The commodity curse. Now, here's where it gets interesting. Argentina controls some of the world's most fertile agricultural land. The Pampas produce enough food to feed 400 million people. The country is the world's 3rd largest soybean exporter and holds 20% of global lithium reserves. This should be a blessing, but it's actually a curse. Over 80% of Argentina's soy production goes to export, making government revenues directly dependent on volatile global commodity prices. When China sneezes, Argentina catches pneumonia. During commodity booms, dollars flood in, the peso strengthens, and the government spends like there's no tomorrow. When prices crash, and they always do, the economy collapses. This cycle has repeated itself 5 times since 1975. Factor 3. The currency psychology. This brings us to the most devastating factor. Argentines don't trust their own currency. After decades of devaluations and confiscations, including the 2001 Corralito, when the government froze all bank accounts, there's a deep cultural preference for US dollars. Economists estimate Argentines hold over 200 billion in cash dollars, mostly hidden in safety deposit boxes or literally under mattresses. That's half of GDP sitting idle, not invested, not productive. Every time there's uncertainty, people rush to convert pesos to dollars, draining central bank reserves and creating the very crisis they feared. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy of collapse. If you find this analysis valuable, subscribe to Faultline Economics. We dive deep like this every week. Factor 4. The Peronist Legacy. But all of this is amplified by Argentina's unique political disease, Peronism. Since the 1940s, this populist model has built a state where powerful unions, business lobbies, and social movements negotiate directly with the government for benefits. In 2022, over half the population received some form of government transfer. The unions alone can paralyze the country. 40% of formal workers are unionized, the highest in Latin America. They've successfully blocked every major reform attempt for 3 decades. This creates massive rigidities. Businesses avoid hiring because labor laws make firing nearly impossible, pushing 46% of workers into the informal economy where they have no protections at all. But all of this hinges on one deciding factor: political consensus. Argentina hasn't had a coherent economic policy lasting more than one presidential term since 1930. Every government reverses the previous one's reforms. Market liberalization is followed by state control, followed by liberalization again. This policy whiplash makes long-term planning impossible and destroys investor confidence permanently. Now, let's connect the dots. What do you think is the most critical challenge for Milei's shock therapy? Can he break the cycle, or will social pressure force another reversal? Drop your analysis in the comments. I read every strategic insight you share. Here's what they won't tell you. Argentina is already negotiating its 24th IMF program since 1956. The fund has created a moral hazard. Governments know they'll eventually get bailed out, so they delay reforms until crisis forces their hand. The 2018 program was the largest in IMF history at $57 billion, and it failed catastrophically, financing capital flight instead of stability. For a masterful deep dive into how sovereign debt crises unfold and why countries default repeatedly, I recommend Default by Gregory Makoff and Lee Buchheit on Audible. It's an eye-opening analysis of the mechanics behind sovereign debt crises. Get your free trial with the link below. This analysis connects directly to our breakdown of China's role in Latin American commodities. You can find that breakdown in the card on screen and linked in the description. It reveals another piece of this strategic puzzle. So what does this mean for Argentina's future? If current trends continue, by 2050 we're looking at one of 2 scenarios. Either Milei's shock therapy succeeds, inflation stabilizes permanently, and Argentina leverages its lithium reserves to become a critical player in the global energy transition. Or, and history suggests this is more likely, the social cost proves unbearable, triggering another default by 2027, accelerating brain drain as educated Argentines flee, and locking the country into permanent middle-income mediocrity while its neighbors prosper. The future isn't written, but the blueprint is there for those who know how to read it. Argentina's crisis isn't about bad luck or external shocks. It's about a political system that rewards short-term populism over long-term stability. Institutions too weak to enforce contracts, and an economy dangerously dependent on commodity cycles it cannot control. If this kind of strategic analysis helps you understand our complex world, subscribe to Faultline Economics and give this video a like. We're building more content like this every week, and as always, stay strategic.